We will have the sun right in our eyes if it comes through that cloud.
It
Um,
will. Anyway, it's better than to have this.
okay.
So, can you just tell where you get this interest to the history of this 20th century? So you mostly focus on the 20th century. So why?
I
Why?
entirely focus on the 20th century, and especially on the Second World War. I was born just after the war, and my father was in special operations executive in the war, and I found very soon, even in childhood, that everybody was defined by whether they'd had a good war or
Mm-hmm.
not. And of course, that fascinated me. But then later, the interest developed in a different way. And one realized that actually the Second World War, and the reason why it still has its fascination today, is because it represents more moral choice than any other period in modern history. And there was a debate in Britain about it, which I think was quite interesting. People were saying, why aren't novels today set in the present, with there are so many different issues which should be addressed, and why is it people so interested in history? And I think, as Robert McCrum, who was the literary editor of The Observer, said, the reason is simply that moral choice is the fundamental element in all human drama. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Second World War holds a fascination for me, as well as for so many other people.
Mm-hmm. Do you get any formal education in history or?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, when I was at Sandhurst as a young officer cadet, John Keegan, who was one of the famous British historians, was my professor, and he became a great friend. And Keegan's great contribution was this book. It was a small book called The Face of Battle. And that, for the first time, turned military history upside down. It was no longer the staff officer, the general, giving a bird's eye view of what happened on the ground, as if they were chess grandmasters, which is ridiculous. It was very much more doing it from the other side, of showing what the experience was like for the soldiers in the front line. And that was something which affected me, or influenced me so much, partly because it hadn't happened before. And I was just very lucky in timing, because taking that on, there had been a period in the 1980s when oral history became very popular in Britain and the United States. And I remember a publisher saying to me, it's interesting, this thing about oral history, because people, yes, are quite interested by it, but actually, the reason why it's never going to do very well is because people feel that it's not a proper book. They feel that, it's just a question of collection of diaries or interviews or whatever it might be. And that very much struck me, because I realized that actually what you needed was a combination of history from above with history from below. The oral history was showing people, especially the young in a post-military health and safety generation, what the reality of total warfare was like. And so that is why I was always working towards that, in that particular direction. And it turned out that after the 80s and the 90s and so forth, people were looking very much more at a more individual version of history rather than the collective version of history of the past.
Mm-hmm. So the interest of the Russian participation in the war, was it some sort of coincidence, or how was it born?
It came about in a strange way. I had worked in the Russian archives when they first opened in 1992, when they first opened to foreigners in 1992.
You did it in person, right?
I did it in person, well, with a translator.
Mm-hmm.
At the time. We worked very closely together, side by side. But this was actually very much more on the French Communist Party, because I was doing a book at the time on Paris after the liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized what a phenomenal resource the Russian Soviet archives were in terms of their scope and so forth. And then it was later that actually I was trying to do a totally different book, when my publisher said, listen, we think it's an interesting idea, but we'd much prefer you to write a book about Stalingrad, about the Battle of Stalingrad, because there hasn't really been anything. And it just happened that Podolsk, thanks to Pikoya, who was the Minister of the Archives, who had made the archives open up. I think I was about one of the first historians in there, into Podolsk, into Zamol. And what I realized was that the the really interesting material was going to lie in the Commissar, the political department report. And I remember at the Ministry of Defence when we were negotiating access or whatever, the colonel there, and it was quite obvious that the army was not used to dealing with foreign historians and their approach to history. He said, "We have a simple rule in our archive. You tell us the subject, we choose the files." And there was no point. There was no point trying to say. There was no point trying to say, "Well, actually, Colonel, it's not doesn't work like that in other archives." So I said, "Yes, of course." But I said, to give you an idea of the sort of material I'm looking for, in the German military archives in Freiburg, in Breisgau, the most interesting articles, the most interesting reports are those by doctors and priests attached to the German army, because they're outsiders and they're giving a really sort of the human detail which I'm interested in. Roar of laughter from the Russian colonel. "No priests in the Red Army." And I said, "No, okay, I realize that, but what about the political department reports?" And that was where the really interesting material was. And the reason for that was because Stalin was so desperate to know the absolute truth of what was going on in Stalingrad. He didn't know whether the generals were lying to him or whatever it was, that the political department of the Stalingrad front was having to fly back a report every single night of between 12 and 24 pages on exactly what had happened that particular day. And here you had the version uncontaminated by any sort of propaganda. It was the exact details of the genuine heroism of soldiers, the genuine successes, but also the genuine failures, and the crossing over to the enemy, surrender, whatever it might be. And so this was absolute gold in sort of archival sense.
John Erickson.
Yes, I worked with John. He was wonderful. He was a huge help to me, especially on the Stalingrad book and in his advice. He was a very generous man.
He is actually the author of the road. Yeah, the Battle of Stalingrad and
the
road to
Stalingrad and the Road to Berlin.
Yeah,
absolutely
fantastic books.
They were fantastic books. Not easy to read for the general public because there was sort of just so much detail. But in many ways, it was John who sort of opened up the subject for the British, I think. And John was completely objective. I mean, there was no doubt about it. He was there. He was working in those archives and from a much earlier stage. But he was also a huge help when it came to me later, when there was the big debate over David Glantz and Operation Mars, a subject which I'm sure we'll come on to later.
It was so. What was the basement of the discussion between you and Glantz?
Well, it wasn't so much Glantz didn't attack me, but I was attacked by Jason Epstein, who had been one of the founders of the New York Review of Books. And Epstein had this sort of I don't know particularly why, where it came from. One or two friends who knew him extremely well said they'd been rather astonished by the ferocity of his attack and what caused it. The point was that Glantz, in his book on Mars, was quite right to say that the Operation Mars, which was this attack against the German Ninth Army close to Rzhev, was not, he said, was tried to argue, was not a diversion. He felt that was a major operation. Now, John Erickson was very dubious about it, but also at the time, Professor Oleg Rzhezhevsky, was being a great help to me. He was passing me more material on Stalingrad. This was after the Stalingrad book, obviously. And he also passed me the discussions which they'd had in the Association of Second World War Historians on Glantz's book, where he said it's very interesting what Glantz has come up with and all the rest of it. But is he right? And actually what then came up when I could start to look at other sources, and one saw, in fact, that Glantz's theory that Zhukov had spent his whole time working on the Rzhev front was totally wrong, because actually the diary of Zhukov's movements showed that he was spending far more time down in Stalingrad and working on Operation Uranus, and was not working on Operation Mars. And then, of course, there was General Sudoplatov, who describes how Mars was entirely a diversion because the NKVD special task actually, through one of the agents, actually gave the information, the details of the attack in advance to the Germans, purely to make sure that they kept their troops there. And in fact, actually, I think it was probably one of the most cynical operations of deception in the whole of, almost the whole of the history of warfare, but certainly in the Second World War, because altogether some 215,000 casualties resulted.
Yeah, but you believe that Sudoplatov is right?
Obviously, one can never be 100%, but I had long conversations with his son, who had worked actually on the book. With his father and his son, Professor Sudoplatov, who I found, I must say, very convincing. He was certain, in fact, that his father would not have invented that particular story about Operation Monastery and the handing of the information over to the Germans. But in any case, as leaving that aside, as Professor Rzeszewski and was it General Gareev, Colonel General Gareev, who was the one who actually wrote up his appreciation or assessment of Glantz's theory. The whole point was that actually the ammunition provided in support of the artillery ammunition provided in support of Mars was virtually zero. I mean, very, very little indeed, which showed that actually it was a sacrifice rather than a major operation. Operation Uranus had many times more ammunition loads per gun per day than in Mars, and that was as far as Rzeszewski and his colleagues were concerned, that was perhaps probably the decisive element. So, whether or not we believe Sudoplatov, I think that there's no doubt about it, that Mars was definitely a deception operation, or a deception operation, rather than a major attack. The trouble was that Glantz in his book was so frustrated by not finding any material in the archives that he actually started inventing, as he admitted himself. I mean, it was very strange. I mean, it was the only time I've come across a historian who's actually filled in, should we say, the gaps in the same sort of way, which is slightly bizarre. But Glantz is a very important and serious historian. But I just think that he got carried away on that particular book. He got carried away by his own thesis.
Mm-hmm. So back to the history.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Was it a Russian success, or was it?
Well, I mean, was it a Russian success? I mean, it was should we say, a temporary success, but it was not a success in the way that Stalin hoped. Stalin hoped that by encouraging Hitler to attack France first, and one has to remember, even Churchill was still thinking of the French army in 1939 as the French army of 1918, when it wasn't. It was basically a shadow of its former self, not just a question of numbers, but above all a question of morale and a question of discipline and all the rest of it. And the quality of its generals, Gamelin was disastrous and a fantasist in many ways. So from that point of view, and also the French, as we know, were desperately reluctant to fight. The British had been reluctant to fight up until March 1939, when, with the occupation of Prague, it was obvious finally that Hitler was a total liar and was going to go on attacking, and that all of his promises were totally wrong. And I'm afraid it needed that long for the British to wake up. But the French were still very reluctant to fight, and afterwards they always blamed the British for actually having forced them into the Second World War when they were incapable of fighting. My uncle was a journalist, he was a Reuters correspondent in France, and I remember him telling me how he would say to the French soldiers, but, there are German troops over there, and this is when they were already fighting in Poland and all the rest. He said, the German troops, aren't you going to fight at them? I said, what? Fire at them? If we fire at them, they'll fire back. I mean, it was pretty. It was pretty pathetic, to put it mildly, which is why it was called the phony war during that particular period. But going back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin though didn't succeed in another way, and that is by this hope that the strength of the French army would wear down the Wehrmacht, and then he, Stalin, would be in a position to impose whatever he wanted afterwards, was not going to work. And Stalin was furious about this, and this was one of the reasons why, for example, particularly at the Tehran conference, he said the French should be made to pay. One of the reasons why he was so angry was, of course, that the French army did not destroy their vehicles, and up to 80% of vehicles in German divisions invading Russia came from the French army. So it was hardly surprising that Stalin was pretty angry with the French. And his attitude only started to change after de Gaulle's visit in December 1944 to Moscow, when it suddenly occurred to Stalin, well, actually, the French might be useful after all, because de Gaulle was the wild card within the Western alliance, and therefore might be useful to... but all of this really comes to the origins of the Cold War, which I think is an interesting subject in itself, which I hope we'll get onto later on.
Yeah. And what about the British position just before the Molotov Pact in April and in August, where the French and Brits came to Moscow for the negotiations,
yes,
and which was failed.
Yes, I can understand the Soviet attitude. Why should they take a ship, which was one of the slowest ships going, which showed basically that they weren't interested. Well, in fact, they were interested, but at the same time, there were two problems. One, of course, was the anti-communism of Neville Chamberlain. He just simply could not believe that any worthwhile alliance with the Soviet Union could work. But the other problem was actually it was the position of the Poles. Because the whole system was only going to work if the Poles were going to allow the Red Army across their territory in support and into Romania if the Germans attacked eastwards. And from that point of view, the Poles, and one has to, shall we say, understand it when looking at subsequent events, did not believe that they would ever be able to get the Red Army to leave afterwards. So they were absolutely fundamentally against it. So actually the British and the French negotiators were in an impossible position. So whether it was a success short term, yes. Whether it was a success long term, I don't think it was. It gave him a little bit of breathing space at a time when we have to remember the Red Army was desperately vulnerable after the purges, and above all the command structure, which still suffered. I mean, even in 1941, in the disastrous summer of 1941, because the senior officers were so terrified of the NKVD and being arrested and all the rest of it, that nobody dared take decisions when they needed to.
Do you think that the purges is really had a big impact on the Red Army? Not the sheer size. I mean, the army is growing about 5 times in a couple of years, and there was not enough officers for it.
It's true there weren't enough officers, but then if you purge your senior officers, you also actually frighten them in terms of getting them to make decisions. And this was the disastrous thing in 1941, because nobody dared to retreat unless they had orders from above, and with the collapse of communications, they weren't able to get orders from above and all the rest of it. So it was not just a question of the numbers of senior officers who had been purged, but it was the psychological effect on the command structure of the Red Army, which was so disastrous, I would have said.
What's your attitude towards Stalin? Is he a great man, or
well, what's interesting, if one compares Stalin and Hitler as war leaders, Stalin was disastrous at the beginning, but then suddenly became a very effective war leader, war commander, in terms of giving his generals their head at the right moment. In the early part, as I say, in 41, and to a certain degree from the first half at least of 42, he was disastrous, frankly. But then, as I say, he started to give the generals their head. Hitler, on the other hand, had actually been quite effective at the beginning, but then became increasingly disastrous, until he got to the point where the British cancelled Operation Foxley, which was the plan to assassinate Hitler by SOE. And because they realized that actually the war would be won rather more rapidly with Hitler in command than a successor commander or leader. So from that point of view, ironically, of course, Stalin cancelled plans to assassinate Hitler, but for very different reasons. That was because he feared that the Western allies, the British and the Americans, might make a deal with a successor government if Hitler was assassinated, and he didn't trust them. Actually, there was no chance of after the statement at Casablanca by Roosevelt on unconditional surrender, there was no way that the British or the Americans could have gone back on that. But the British and the Americans did make a major mistake in 1944 with the July plot, the attempt to blow up Hitler by his own officers, because they assumed on that basis that any army which was prepared to kill their own commander-in-chief must be in a state of disintegration. Well, yes, there's a superficial logic in that, but it's a question of, you've got to understand, this is one of the classic intelligence failures of the Second World War, you've got to understand the mentality. You've got to understand the mind, get into the mind of the German commanders, because the very fact that Hitler survived meant that actually the Nazis were going to, and the SS and obviously Hitler, were going to be able to control the German army with a far tighter fist right up to the end of the war, and therefore the war would go on until the day Hitler died, rather than any hope of it being ended by individual surrenders of German troops. And it wasn't until right up at the very end, with Wolf in Sweden, in Italy and so forth, that this disintegration started to happen.
Mm-hmm. Back to the Stalin issue. I mean, in
Yes.
general, not only in the war. What's your attitude to him?
Well, I would agree with Sakharov, Andrei Sakharov, on that. You know that Stalin killed many more people than Hitler, but Hitler had to be defeated first, and there's no doubt about that, because with the hunger plan and the idea of the elimination of 30 million Soviet citizens, civilians, it would have been a catastrophe which would have dwarfed even the Shoah, even the Holocaust. So from that point of view, I don't think there's any doubt about it. But Stalin was a killer, there's no doubt about it. He was a very effective leader. And this brings out other differences between, obviously, a dictatorship at war and democracies at war. And there are many ironies, which again is another subject we could always get onto, which I think is quite interesting. But Stalin himself was by the end, was a great war leader in terms of Soviet power. That's absolutely true. I mean, even Churchill and his advisors were appalled at how effective and clever he was at Yalta and Tehran in those major conferences. By the time of Potsdam, he was in a completely superior position, if you like, from that point of view. So he was a brilliant diplomatist, and obviously he had a very, very clear focus. That didn't make him a nice man. And when you see actually the purges of the Red Army in 1945, which I think have tended to be underestimated, it's pretty terrifying. He was afraid, obviously, of Bonapartism, he was afraid of Zhukov, which is one of the reasons why Zhukov didn't discover for 20 years that actually Hitler's body had been found. But that was all part of Stalin's tricks to try to keep his generals under control. But his attitude towards the Soviet people, I think, was shown by that notorious speech when he referred to them as the screws and cogs in the machine.
Wow, no, not really.
Hmm?
It was true.
Come on, come on. I mean, I think that was a very, very revealing. That was a very revealing speech.
Mm. Okay. Do you think that the American capital was? Well, I'm talking quite a lot with the German veterans, German Wehrmacht and SS veterans, and most of them say that it's Americans who was actually started the Second World War. What do you think about it?
Well, they say that, but I mean, most people in Germany still believe that it was the Americans who declared war on Germany, when in fact it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. And you tell Germans that, and they look at you in total disbelief. So I wouldn't rely on what German veterans say on that. Now, what is true is that and this may have played their part, the American capital played a very strong role in the Spanish Civil War. Texaco, various banks, and all the rest of it who were financing Franco during that particular period. The role of the Telecom, the Telefonica, ITT, as it later became. All of these organizations did play a large role. No, one has to remember the situation that Roosevelt was not able to give arms or sell arms even to the British and the Americans, even when they paid for it, because of the Neutrality Act, which had been passed during the Spanish Civil War. So he had his hands tied. There was very little that American organizations could do. I mean, they would love to have been able to sell weapons to the British and the French. And actually, the British and the French did manage to buy a certain amount, and actually they paid very high prices in 1939. And this actually, as many Americans refused to acknowledge, helped actually trigger the American economic takeoff, which obviously became huge during the Second World War. One has to remember that up until that point, it was still the tail end of the Depression in America, and America had been hit far harder than any other country, except perhaps Germany, by the Depression. So there was that aspect. But I mean, the Americans were absolutely brutal towards the British in terms of when Lend-Lease was announced. And they provided weapons. The British had to prove that they were bankrupt. And for that, the Americans secretly in the deal, and this was never said at the time, took over every single British company in the United States and North America, including Cortez, which was one of the richest. And they also sent a cruiser to South Africa to pick up the last of Britain's gold reserves before. So although Churchill in the House of Commons described it as one of the most unsordid acts in history, i.e. that it was one of the most generous acts in history, it wasn't. It was very, very hard-headed. Again, that is something that you don't hear very much from American historians on.
Yeah, well, Americans were the only, profited from the war.
Yes, they did hugely. Yeah. They profited hugely. I mean, not only did they become a superpower. This is the fascinating thing about the Tehran Conference, that you saw Stalin as a result of the victory at Stalingrad and what would have followed in the advances in 1943. You see Stalin and the Soviet Union as suddenly emerging as not just as a great power, but actually as a superpower, one of the two world superpowers. The British position and, of course, the French, because the two empires were in collapse and they were both bankrupt. And, of course, the Americans were the others. So suddenly one had this sort of this binary world.
Do you think that the key motive to fight for the Russians were the fear of, NKVD or some sort of punishment? Was it the motivation to...
No, there was real motivation. One had to see, one only had to look at the lines of volunteers on the first day after the invasion. I mean, even though Molotov made one of the worst speeches probably at the time, there was no doubt there was an absolute outrage on behalf of the Russian, the Soviet people, and they were all queuing up to fight. The interesting thing is, and I do think this is a terribly important subject, which has never really been covered in Russia, is when one talks about the actual fighting capacities of the different countries during the Second World War and their different motivations. Now, in the case, obviously, of the Soviet Union, there was that feeling of outrage, the numbers of volunteers who came forward, whether it was for the army or even just to help in some ways. It was the greatest in the whole of any country in the Second World War, there's no doubt about that. The German civilians weren't that excited at the start of the Second World War. The only time they were excited was the return from France when they thought that the war was over, not knowing that Hitler had this plan to invade the Soviet Union. The British felt, well, it's something we've got to do, but there was no sort of not excitement, but there was no determination really. It was just the feeling it's something we've got to do. In Russia, it was totally different. In the Soviet Union, it was totally different. But the interesting thing is, when one looks at, say, Stalingrad, and one looks at the fight there, no Western army would have survived at Stalingrad. There's no doubt about it. And this is, again, the difference between the armies of dictatorships and the armies of democracies. They held on partly, to a large degree, out of real determination, but also because of the pressure, the threat of execution by NKVD, by the special departments. And that's no surprise. I mean, frankly, the fighting conditions at Stalingrad were worse than probably any other battle in the Second World War. I mean, it's always hard to compare these things. So yes, one knows, and the numbers. So there's a debate over that, over the figures. It was John Ericsson who came up with the figure of the 13,500 executions for the whole of the Stalingrad campaign. Some people though have Jochen Helwig has sort of cast doubt on that. I'm not sure. I think that his was a much more narrower focus. So it's a question of how you debate these things. But as I was saying, with those reports, which were absolutely reliable from the political department of the Stalingrad front, there was no doubt that there was both genuine heroism and obviously there was cases of genuine cowardice and of crossing over to the enemy and things like that by soldiers who were basically civilians who'd had a rifle thrust into their hands and arms. Now, the interesting thing was that the British were the first to do any research into fighting capacity and fighting intent. And in 1943, a Major Lionel Wigram did this report, having done a lot of research and interviews and so forth. And he came up with this report saying that within the average platoon of 30 men, there were probably about 3 or 4 who were the real fighters. There were probably about 3 or 4 who wanted to run away at the first opportunity. And the main group in between would follow the fighters if things were going well, or would run away with the others when they were going badly. Now, the Germans actually had a very similar analysis of their own troops. Now, I'm talking here of average conscript troops. I'm not talking about elite divisions like paratroopers or Waffen-SS or anything like that on either side. And they had the same thing, the Einsatzfreudigen, those who loved fighting, the Einsatzgehemmten, and those who had sort of run away and all the rest of it. The Americans did much more research towards the end of the war, a large amount, and they found actually that the majority of soldiers didn't actually even fire their weapon in battle. They just sort of kept their heads down. Funnily enough, I remember in some of the Russian documents, there were Red Army officers who were saying that after each engagement we should have a rifle inspection and anybody with a clean barrel should be shot as a deserter. So I think all the armies were actually finding, on average troops, as I say, were finding fairly similar contrast between the really good soldiers and those who were bad soldiers. So when one talks about sort of the Red Army soldier, you can never generalize. I mean, there were some really superb, many superb and very, very brave ones. But also there were going to be others, as we know from all of the reports, who were going to try and escape at the first opportunity, just like the British Army and probably the Americans too. I mean, the numbers of deserters from both the British Army and the American Army by 1944 was pretty staggering, as there were from the Red Army. So, I think the important thing is to try to look at it in as objective a way as one possibly can, which is never very easy, and understand it. Rather than try to make a sacred version of what one's own soldiers from one's own country achieved during the Second World War.
Coffee break.
Coffee break. Excellent. Thank you, Luba. What do you